today. I need to begin with a pretty serious trigger warning. And with that, so really people to consider that if they need to, I will not judge them. On the contrary, if you feel that you would like to leave now. So there are going to be very graphic descriptions, and so please keep that in mind, or if you have to leave at any point. With that, I'll now introduce our speaker. I am Rhona Seidelman, as I mentioned. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. I'm an associate professor of history, and I also hold the Schusterman Chair for Modern Israel Studies. I'm a scholar of Israeli history and the history of medicine and public health. So with that, next week we will be marking 2 years since October 7th, 2023, when Hamas perpetrated a massacre in Israel. And in retaliation, Israel declared war on Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The idea for this talk came from the question of how do we continue to memorialize and talk about the experience of October 7th within an academic setting. So this has to be different from a community setting or a community memorialization or a student-led memorialization or even a religious memorialization. And that's because of our commitment, mission, and priority as an academic institution. So some of you may recall in November of 2023, Rabbi Vered Harris of Temple B'nai Israel in Oklahoma City invited my colleagues Alan Levinson, Hadass Cohen, and myself to speak on a panel where we considered what our research in our various fields of Jewish history had taught us about this historical moment. I found it to be a very helpful and thought-provoking discussion, and so I wanted to apply Rabbi Harris's approach to our center. My hope is that over the years, different colleagues will want to give this talk because I feel that our different fields each has a very valuable perspective to offer. And some of the ideas that came to my mind are periods of painful vocal disagreement between prominent Jewish thinkers and their responses to historical events. The first thing that comes to mind is the Eichmann trial. Which had really vocal Hannah Arendt's response, and I think it was Sheldon's response to Hannah Arendt, which were very, very, very angry and passionate. Another one would be Jewish theological responses to despair and terror. Division between the American and Israeli communities. Ideological fissures between the right and left within American Jewry. Ideological fissures between the Jewish left and the non-Jewish left in America and around the world, and the history of the Arab-Israel conflict. How earlier Jewish communities in the Middle Ages or the early modern period responded to pogroms and violent attacks on civilians, their artistic, intellectual, and societal responses. And then, of course, the history of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. This subject is not easy to take on, considering the incredible pain surrounding the subject of October 7th. There are 48 hostages that were taken from Israel who are still being held in Gaza in horrific circumstances. We don't know how many of them are alive. There's also the pain surrounding Israel's military action in Gaza today, the war that Israelis are still living through with displaced people, ruined homes and lives, massive trauma and PTSD. Excuse me. There are the daily attacks on and abuses of Palestinian civilians by Israeli settlers and the Israeli military in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. There's the horrific suffering in Gaza with tens of thousands of people killed, destroyed infrastructure, millions of displaced people living in dire circumstances and widespread hunger. There are accusations of genocide against the Israeli military and government by prominent scholars of genocide history and law. There are passionate rejections of those accusations, including by the Israeli branch of Amnesty International, which was then thrown out of Amnesty International because of their objections to the designation of genocide, and passionate rejections of those accusations also by prominent scholars of genocide history and law. Adding to the complexity of this task is the terrifying rise in and normalization of anti-Semitism in America throughout the world, which is further complicated by the cynical political use of the idea of anti-Semitism by many non-Jews and Jews in America as a cover for certain political and ideological aims. So today, my focus will be on the Israeli experience of October 7th and not the broader war that continues to rage. And so one way to understand or justify this focus is from study of the Holocaust. While it's important to discuss the Holocaust, while including the persecution of the Roma, the Sinti, homosexuals, mentally disabled, along with the Jews, it is also legitimate to take time in different settings to focus on each of these communities. But I think the easiest way for a North American audience to understand this is through a parallel with 9/11. And as President Joe Biden pointed out, the casualty toll of October 7th in proportion to the Israeli population was the equivalent of 15 9/11s. September 11th, of course, is forever connected to the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's imperative to understand the broader historical connection and the thread of human suffering that connects the devastation in New York and the devastation in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's also legitimate and necessary to pay tribute to the experience and pain of 9/11 as its own separate national trauma. And so as we move further away from October 7th, but it remains as an extremely painful open wound, that is my focus for today's talk, where I will consider the ways the Jewish history I research have framed the perspective I have on this massacre. So let me now briefly explain what we know about October 7th, 2023. On the morning of Saturday, October 7th, over 1,500 heavily armed Hamas terrorists broke into Israel and laid siege to 24 towns, small cities, and kibbutzim that are near the border. I think I have a map here. Let's see. This is a photograph from one of the sort of famous images of the trucks that were coming into the town. And this is a map of the border, so you can see Gaza and the towns surrounding. In a sophisticated, intricate operation, they ambushed Israeli civilians through the air, by sea, and on trucks, overflowing with heavily armed men who carried automatic guns, grenades, and RPGs. Hamas wreaked additional havoc overhead, launching an estimated 3,500 rockets into civilian neighborhoods across Israel within a 24-hour period. These rockets provided cover for the ground invasions, ensuring that the Hamas terrorists would find their victims in their bomb shelters, in their homes, and on roads. This was an organized and intentionally brutal massacre, primarily of civilians in sovereign Israeli territory. Hamas planned their attack for early on a Saturday morning during the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah, when as many people as possible would be home, would be out for their morning coffee, getting a day of holiday and rest together with their families. Around 1,200 people were killed that day, and the majority were civilians. 260 of the dead are college students and young adults who are taking advantage of their last day of holiday to attend the outdoor Nova Music Festival. And because the Otef Aza is very close to Beersheba and Sderot, Beersheba has the university and Sderot has a college, so that's where many of the students were coming from. Terrorists took 251 hostages with them into Gaza. They include babies, women, and elderly men and elderly women. We know from reports that they were terribly abused. Today, over 48 hostages remain, and we don't know exactly how many are still alive. The hostages were driven across the border in trucks and held throughout Gaza in private homes, hospitals, and underground in tunnels. The majority of these people are Jewish Israelis, but the hostages, as well as the dead and the surviving victims, are also Bedouin citizens of Israel, the Druze, as well as migrant workers from Thailand and some international tourists. Adding to the horror of October 7th was the sheer brutality. Terrorists tortured, horrifically raped, mutilated, and decapitated victims. They did this while filming themselves and celebrating their cruelty. In many cases, they used the victims' phones to live stream their murder and abuse to their family and friends. That is, like the family and friends of the victims. It quickly became apparent that October 7th marked a turning point in the contemporary Jewish and contemporary Israeli experiences. As historian Aryeh Sapoznik has put it, quote, "There are moments of crisis in Jewish life that call out for renewed thinking and social, cultural, political transformation, and October 7th is one such moment." In response to October 7th, Israel declared war on Hamas and began a fierce military campaign with the declared aims of destroying Hamas and liberating the hostages. In retaliation, the Hamas's fighters are embedded within the civilian population. They're fortified within sophisticated tunnels built under civilian populations. Since October 7th, Israel has killed over 60,000 people in Gaza. This number is according to Hamas, and we don't know how many of the people were Hamas fighters, but there's no doubt that a staggering number of Palestinian civilians have been killed, including a huge number of women, the elderly, and children. And Gaza is being devastated by this conflict. Israel experienced hundreds of thousands of internally displaced refugees and people who lost their homes and whose communities have been devastated. This is a brief summary of the situation. There are many details that I'm missing, but this is to get us started in understanding why Israel and Jews around the world have been forever changed by October 7th. If I could just ask Summer, I don't mean to call you up. Do you mind not doing the type? I'm finding it very loud. I'm sorry. I could give you a piece of paper.
No, I apologize.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. From the Mouth of the Raped Woman, Rivka Schiff, is an article by Hebrew scholar Michal Dekel. It was published in Women's Studies Quarterly in 2008. In this article, Professor Dekel focuses on the first-hand testimony of the Jewish woman, Rivka Schiff, who was gang raped along with her young neighbor, Simi Zichek, during the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. The Kishinev pogrom took place in what is present-day Moldova. It began on April 6, 1903, after a lie was spread that Jews were planning to sacrifice a Christian child on Easter. These riots lasted for 3 days. Russians swarmed to Kishinev from surrounding towns to participate. The attacks on Jews were led by high school and college students. The government and local police and military forces did nothing to stop them. Men, women, and children were beaten, mutilated, and murdered. 49 Jews were killed, 587 were injured, 1,350 houses were destroyed, and around 2,000 families were left homeless. Dekel writes that Kishinev became, at least until the Holocaust, a code word for the brutalization and vulnerability of Jews, the most traumatic event in modern Jewish memory. 2 aspects of the Kishinev pogrom that made it so indelible, according to Dekel, not only the level of brutality, but the quote, unprecedented ways in which this brutality was represented and reported and disseminated worldwide. It was reported on in major international newspapers, and it shaped culture with plays, songs, poems, and essays. It was the first pogrom that was photographed extensively, which she describes as the first visually documented horror of the 20th century, and dating images of World War I. She refers also, and this is interesting, to it coinciding with and maybe signaling the beginning of a new sensationalist media that's violence obsessed and globally oriented news coverage that feeds on blood and gore. The major remembrance of the Kishinev pogrom, as many of you I'm sure know, was the poem Be'ir HaHariga, in the city of killing, that was composed by the Zionist writer from Odessa, Chaim Nachman Bialik. Bialik devotedly collected oral testimonies of the survivors with the intention of publishing them in a book. And this was commissioned by the Jewish Historical Committee in Odessa. But he put that project aside and did not release the testimonies in his lifetime. Instead, he wrote the poem, which became one of the most famous articulations of the pogrom. Dekel writes that Bialik's poem centered on witnessing, on male witnessing, whereas by centering the voices of testimony, particularly the voice of Rivka Schiff, Dekel has sought to clear the field of vision and let us hear the woman's experience of the horrors of Kishinev about the Zionist male poet's adaptation of her story. I don't know if this is something we can see. I'm going to read a little bit of it because of what Michal Dekel said with the centering of the voice. When the swine broke into the attic through the roof, a few of them jumped on the Zichik daughter first. They slapped her and formed a circle around her. She fell on the floor from the blow. They raised her dress, turned her face downward and her behind upward, and began slapping her on her behind with their hands. Then they turned her around again, parted her legs, covered her eyes and her mouth so she wouldn't scream. One climbs on top of her and the others kneel down around her and wait for their turn. They all did what they did in front of all the people in the attic. A few jumped on top of me and my husband. He wanted to escape and I am behind him. They attacked him, give money. Harlechek wanted to taunt me and ask me for money. I asked for pity. Don't touch me, Miti. You have known me and have been acquainted with me for many years. I don't have money. Several of them ripped my dress from behind and one slapped my cheek and said, if you don't have money, we'll enjoy you in another way. Systematic rape and gang rape were a part of Hamas's tactics on October 7th. This was documented by the Association for Rape Crisis Centers in Israel, in the film Screams Before Silence, in the British Parliamentary Report on October 7th by the Israeli Branch of Physicians for Human Rights, and later by Pramila Patten of the UN, and most recently in the Dina Project. But it took a long time for the UN to pay any attention to this. In contrast to the first-hand testimony from Rivka Schiff, on October 7th, the majority of women who were raped were murdered during or after they were attacked.
Can you just raise the volume a little bit? We can't hear you back here.
Oh, I'm sorry, you can't hear
Thank
me.
you.
Okay. Okay. In contrast to the first-hand testimony from Rivka Schiff, on October 7th, the majority of women who were raped were murdered during or after they were attacked. According to the Dina report, quote, many of those who did survive are likely to be too traumatized to be able to recount their experience. And it was more than 17 months after the attack that one survivor from the Nova Music Festival was able to recount her experience. And so where with Kishinev, the women's testimony is so important, the majority of evidence from October 7th are the silenced and brutalized bodies. As reported by Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, there were cases of gang rape of young women at the Nova Party, women, girls, and the elderly who were raped so repeatedly, aggressively in their homes and at the party that their pelvic bones broke. This is from the Dina report, which came out this summer. I think I have This is a quote. Reports and testimonies point to recurring patterns with indicative features. This is the bodies found with foreign objects inserted into the genitals, bodies bearing signs of genital mutilation, and bodies, mostly of women, discovered at various sites, either fully or partially undressed from the waist down with hands bound, and gunshot wounds, often to the head or genitals. In some cases, such as along Route 232, and at the Nova Festival site, bodies were found tied to structures, trees, or poles. Additional patterns include bodies lying on the ground with legs spread and genitals exposed. These recurring features were identified across multiple locations, including Kibbutzim, the Nova Festival area, and Route 232. And like in Kishinev, many of these cases of gang rape and sexual abuse were done to the women in front of their family members. One survivor testimony is from a 94-year-old grandmother from one of the towns whose young granddaughter was sexually abused and murdered in front of her. A central part of October 7th has been the many human rights activists, feminists, and feminist organizations who have ignored, denied, or belittled the sexual torture of women and girls in Israel. This includes Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, the National Organization of Women's Studies, and here on campus, the student group OU Women's Health Advocacy. You can look on their Instagram to see their post on Palestinian women's health from December 9, 2023. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be writing about Palestinian women's health, but you would think that there could be room to talk about what happened on October 7th. In her essay, Dekel writes, Zionism created a new person who is affected by Jewish history. Oh, actually, sorry, I want to cut that out. Sorry. So why do I recount these horrific details? I certainly don't want to sit with them. And we need to be careful not to sensationalize or become desensitized to these events through repetition. And we need to be careful to honor the victims who can't decide what we do or do not share. But as scholars, sometimes we need to sit with the brutalities of history. We've already seen the memory of October 7th being distorted and denied. So I turn here to the words of Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi in his magisterial book, Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory. I quote, in the world in which we live, it is no longer merely a question of the decay of collective memory and the declining consciousness of the past, but of the aggressive rape of whatever memory remains, the deliberate distortion of the historical record. And he wrote this far before social media made it so effective in reaching all across the world, and lies and historical distortions. He continues writing, against the agents of oblivion, the shredders of documents, the assassins of memory, the revisers of encyclopedias, the conspirators of silence, only the historian, with the austere passion for fact, proof, evidence, which are central to his vocation, can effectively stand guard. This is a flyer that appeared on our campus 2 days after October 7th. It says, do you see the events in vacuum, or do you recognize the decades of oppression and injustice that preceded them? Free Palestine. In November 1945, thousands of Egyptians participated in an anti-Zionist demonstration in Abdin Square in Cairo, where they were addressed by the leader and founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. Afterwards, some of the demonstrators entered a Jewish neighborhood and over the course of 2 days, attacked bystanders, shops, and synagogues. 6 people were killed, several hundred were injured, stores were looted, and the Ashkenazi synagogue in the Muski neighborhood was set on fire. In 1948, after Egypt, along with the armies of other Arab countries, attacked the newly established state of Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood increased their attacks on Jews in Egypt, and they did this under the guise of anti-Zionism. On June 20th, they set off a bomb in Cairo that killed 22 Jews and wounded 41. On September 22nd, they detonated another bomb in a different Jewish neighborhood that killed 19 people and wounded 62. What I'd like to point out about these attacks is that they were perpetrated against Jews, not Zionists. And the first in 1945 was 3 years before Israel even existed as a state, right after the end of the Holocaust, when the global Jewish community had been decimated and was light years away from being the military power that it is today. And the other ones in 1948 were also against Jews, not Zionists, but they were committed under the guise and justification of attacking Zionists. The other thing I'd like to point out is that Hamas is a Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood that was established in 1988. Hamas was established in 1988, and the Muslim Brotherhood was established in Egypt in 1928. It is a radical Islamist group for which anti-Semitism is central to their worldview. And so, in protesters around the world, including on our campus, insist that their anti-Zionism is not anti-Jewish bigotry, that Hamas's October 7th attacks were an iteration of resistance is justified when a people are occupied or by any means necessary. To put it mildly, I do not believe them. The Muslim Brotherhood and other Arabs and other Palestinians have been murdering Jews who were not Zionists, who were not Israelis, before the state of Israel existed and before Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights in 1967. And for anyone using the popular phrase, October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It appeared here 2 days later, but this was a phrase that clearly had something to do with a wider sort of understanding on October 7th that came out very quickly, and you hear it repeated and repeated. So for anyone using the popular phrase, October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, my question is, how far back does this non-vacuum go for you to consider the violence legitimate? Would any of these people say of 9/11, it was terrible, but you know it didn't happen in a vacuum? And I'm not American, and I wasn't in America during 9/11, so maybe there were these types of responses. I'd be curious. Would it be okay to say that watching the planes hitting the Twin Towers was an exhilarating act of resistance? As a professor, I believe he was at Rutgers, a professor at Rutgers said to Cheers right after October 7th. Would these same people say about Sabra and Shatila, the 1982 massacre of around 1,000 Palestinians by Christian phalangists in the context of the Lebanese Civil War? Would they say, well, it didn't happen in a vacuum because beforehand, Palestinians had assassinated the beloved phalangist leader Bashir and had killed several dozen phalangists a few days before? Or would they simply say, as they should, that these were horrific, inexcusable acts? Anyone saying this phrase, October 7th, didn't happen in a vacuum, has to check themselves and recognize the anti-Jewish bigotry and appalling justification of sadism and cruelty that they are proliferating. I want to go back to a point that I said that I would cut out, but now I'll say it since I see I have a bit more time than I anticipated. So in her essay, Michal Deckel wrote that Zionism created a new person who is affected by Jewish history, but at the same time cut off from it. I think, and this is something that I'm just sort of thinking through, and I'd welcome sort of thoughts on this, but I think that this could be an important way for us to understand how October 7th has changed things. This was an intimate attack on Jews that felt like it belonged in a bygone era, right? Similar to what we're just, the parallels with the Kishinev are very striking. And perhaps this too is what American Jewry is experiencing, that one of the most successful Jewish communities in history is facing anti-Semitism that feels like it belongs in a bygone era, where Jews are facing harassment in streets, in university classrooms, in public schools, and being killed in a few cases outside Jewish spaces. Some of you may know this beautiful account from Amos Oz's beautiful book, A Tale of Love and Darkness, his sort of autobiographical narrative. I think he referred to it as an autobiographical novel. He has this incredible description of Kaftet b'November, the United Nations declaration, sort of a partition plan or support for the existence of a Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state in 1947. He has this beautiful description of his family, very moving. He was a child at home and he had fallen asleep and he woke up to the roar of crowds that were roaring. And he came out, and then when the vote was passed in favor of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine and historic land of Israel, the whole community just burst out in roars of not even just delight, but of pain and relief, and so much emotion. It's an incredible book and it's an incredible account. And then he describes this interaction with his father who was crying and who he had never seen cry before. His father says that after this point, he would never be harassed for being Jewish. And then in the dark, he shares a story as he's putting him to sleep. And in the dark, he shares a story. The father shares a story of him and his brother being harassed and denigrated by kids in his school in Europe for being Jewish. And then his father, Amos Oz's grandfather, Alexander, came to the school to complain and to stand up for his children. And at that point, quote, the bullies attacked his father, Grandpa, in front of his eyes, forced him down onto the paving stones and removed his trousers too in the middle of the playground. And the girls laughed and made dirty jokes, saying that the Jews were all so-and-sos, while the teachers watched and said nothing, or maybe they were laughing too. He continues, this is a quote, in a voice of darkness, with his hand still losing its way in my hair because he was not used to stroking me. My father told me under my blanket in the early hours of the 13th of November, 1947, bullies may well bother you in the street or at school someday. They may do it precisely because you are a bit like me, and by that I think he meant like a nerd. But from now on, from the moment we have our own state, you will never be bullied just because you are a Jew and because Jews are so-and-sos. Not that, never again. From tonight, that's finished here forever. And clearly, it has not finished there. How do we spend enough time remembering October 7th and understanding the impact it has had on our community without getting pulled into a space where this is all we see? This balance is something we all have to figure out for ourselves, and that needs constant questioning and re-questioning. I know that I'm in a constant state of dissonance, and that my own sense of this balance shifts when I'm in Israel and when I'm here in America. When I find myself forgetting the infinite value of every human life, or getting sucked into a sense of vengeance, the words of the Israeli scientist, philosopher, and political activist Yeshayahu Leibovitz serve as an important reminder. He wrote his essay after Kibia, after a series of violent attacks between Palestinians and Israelis in 1953. In this essay, he asks, what is a just reprisal in the context of war? He considers the Jewish community's changed status and responsibility from a formerly stateless people to a state with tremendous power. He considers the heavy responsibility that a nation state has to protect its citizens and at times to fight wars. And he raises a comparison of Israel's situation to that of the Allies in the Second World War and the devastation they caused to Japanese and German civilians to end the Second World War. But then he writes, it is therefore possible to justify this action, but let us not try to do so. Let us rather recognize its distressing nature. This idea is something many of us need as a reminder of how to look at the devastation inflicted upon Palestinians, while others need this as a reminder of how to look at the devastation inflicted upon Israelis. To close, I'd like to go back to what I said in a talk I gave here a few days after the October 7th massacre, because I think it's worth reflecting on today. Next, Simchat Torah in 1 year, so now it's 2 years. The horrifying images and news and numbers that we are all seeing these days will have stopped coming in. We may never see the images of the hostages again, so alive and human in these horrifying videos of their capture. There will be more atrocities and events that capture our short attention spans, but it is our responsibility to document, bear witness, and educate about the slaughter of October 7th, 2023. Thank you. Before we move to questions, I had just a few photographs and trying to think about ways like remembrances. I brought a few photographs of some people. Some of them are very well known. This is the Matias family, and I think it's Shlomi and Rhona, the parents who were murdered on October 7th. And they were in their safe room. Their daughters were hiding and managed, all of their children survived. Their son was with them, and they fell. I think his mother fell specifically on to him, to her son, her 16-year-old son, to save him. And the bullet it penetrated from her, and it did hit him, but he survived. And Dvora is the daughter, some of us know of, a leading scholar of Israeli history and Jewish studies, Ilan Troen. And he was also one of my PhD advisors. We, of course, I mean, these are some of the images. This is the Bibas family, the Shiri, Kfir, and Ariel. These are from some of the images, and then thinking about the Michal Deckel's article about how the Kishinev pogrom was very unique, not only in its brutality, but in the way that the photographs and the images. And I think that there's obviously some parallel there also with October 7th and this live streaming that happened, right? I know that, I mean, this was something so many of us were going through, right? On October 7th, when my husband told me, whatever you do, don't go onto social media, as these images were coming through, and right, and this was being live streamed. And then this is Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir. And this is the father, Yarden Bibas, as he was being, he had been separated from them in their safe room, and he was taken, as many people know, this is, a very famous case. Yarden survived in captivity in Gaza. They were all taken as hostages, and he was released. How long ago? Does anyone remember? I don't know if it was a year ago, or I don't even remember anymore, but some time ago. And Shiri and Ariel and Kfir were murdered in Gaza, and the forensic evidence showed that they had been strangled soon after they had been abducted. And again, sort of the issue of raising these incredibly terrible stories, because we also need to remember them. So with that, we have time for questions. And if you have any questions. Yeah, please.
Rhona, did I understand you correctly as saying that this is going to be an annual event, that you're going to have scholars speak on this title every year?
Possibly, if it's something that could work. I mean, we could see if this is something. I think, there's the question of how to do this and whether this is something that will work And maybe afterwards you can tell me if this is something that works and or whether October 7th has to be moved into more of a community memorialization. Like what happened also, and here's like what happened in America with 9/11, was it addressed in academic settings?
Yes.
Yes.
There were anti-war protests. There were a lot of different views on what happened.
Definitely different views, but in terms of understanding like whether it was then.
There were lots of references, including most famously, I think, most notably, forgotten the guy's name, someone in the room will remember the Native American scholar who was fired from his job for
At the
talking.
University of Colorado, right?
Was it
I think.
talking about chickens coming home to roost?
Hmm.
And that was a reference originally from Malcolm X, who talked about the Kennedy assassination in that way.
Hmm.
So there were plenty of scholars and people in the media who were saying essentially, what did you expect to happen?
Got it.
Not that 9/11 was a good thing, but what did you expect to happen?
And did you have the celebrations that you had? Alan, you have your hand up, sorry. Oh, yeah,
Well,
oh, sorry. Yeah.
or we open to comments as well as questions. I've been struck recently by, I don't have quite as many family as you do living in Israel, but enough. And not as many friends as you have, but enough. And
Not as many friends in.
you have generally, that's true also. But I'm really been struck recently by the sort of chronological gap between Israelis, I think actually not just Israeli Jews, I think Israelis, about 10 million now, I understand, and American Jews in particular, for whom time has marched on. And now just this week, government shutdowns, more school shootings, the massacre of the LDS community, a undisputed genocide in Sudan, which nobody disagrees is taking place right now. And for those of us who live here, it's moved on. But when I talk to my friends and family in Israel, it's the day after October 7th, 2023. Sorry if I go on here, but my brother-in-law is still helping cleaning up communities up in the north in Kiryat Shmona, and I still have family who are rather ambivalently, because they're all anti-Bibi in my family, going to serve in Miluim in Gaza City, most unhappily about it, but unwilling to let their friends in the same units who they've served with for 20 years go in there and not be there to support them. So I'm just struck, you brought up Yerushalmi, one of the great modern Jewish great historians, and I'm just struck by how there seem to be two clocks running right now in the two most important centers of Jewish life, one in Israel and one here.
It's a great point, right? I'm not sure. There's the personal aspect of the trauma of the 7th that, people are close to in different ways, to different extents. And then there are sort of the communal trauma and the national trauma. And I think also in Israel, and this is something I think most people know, but many maybe don't, that there are massive demonstrations weekly for an end to the war and for a ceasefire and end to the war, and for a return of the hostages, for the hostage led by the majority of the hostage families, not all hostage families, which is interesting. Of course, like there are people with different backgrounds and different positions who have different views. Most notably, I think the family of Avinatan Or, and he was very famously abducted with his girlfriend Noah Al-Gamani. There was a video of them being taken off Noah Al-Gamani was kidnapped on a motorcycle. And he was being kidnapped next to her. Noah Al-Gamani was freed. They were both students at Ben Gurion University. And Noah Al-Gamani was freed through an IDF operation. Again, I've lost sort of track of time, whether it was a year ago, whether it was a year and a half ago, I don't quite know. And Avinatan Or is still in captivity in Gaza. We don't know if he's alive, but his parents do not sort of agree with the sort of hostage. But there have been these massive demonstrations, all like weekly and all around the country. The main center is in Tel Aviv, but these are happening. And so I think that aspect of sort of the war continuing and in Israel also sort of makes sense. Also, there's the fact that there continue to be missiles from Yemen that people are dealing with. And then there was the period of conflict. I don't even know what to call it anymore, whether it was like a war within the war with Iran over the summer. So people are dealing with it in a very personal way, in a way in Israel that maybe not everybody is dealing with here. Yes.
You drew some kind of a correlation between the Kishinev pogrom and the October 7. This is a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit misleading. The horrific action in both cases are horrific. There's no question about that. But the Jews in Kishinev did not have anyone to defend themselves. The October 7 was, I'm not talking about the Hamas. The October 7 was a total failure of IDF and the government. If they were acting properly, October 7 will be another action of the terrorists that every 6 months or a year we have these different types of exchange of fire between the Hamas and the Israeli IDF. So there is no correlation. The only correlation is being that Jews and Israelis are being the victims, but you are expected that the IDF will do its job.
I completely agree with you. And what I was trying to raise here was the experiences that were so similar for the people who went through it. The issue of the IDF and Israel is something that's very sort of central to the story. And you speak to like the experiences of people saying over and over again, like where, like, first of all, that the army is coming and where is the army? It was a shocking failure of the leadership of the government and of the military, right? I mean, this is like not central to, but I know, right? This I mentioned in a talk I gave 2 years ago, that the year before, like on Simchat Torah, so exactly a year before, my family and I were in Israel and we went for a holiday at one of these small kibbutzim on the Otif, right? And I remember going there and driving along the wall, right, with the border with Gaza, and it felt so eerie. And I was there with my young children, and I'm not a risk taker, right? And I remember saying to myself, okay, this is the most protected border in the world, right? And the fact that that was not the case, right, is astounding. There's a book that just came out, I think this past few months, by Amir Buchbut and Yaakov Katz, who are military, the sort of experts on military history and military correspondence in the Israeli press. And it's called While Israel Slept or something like that. And it's this like brutal, not brutal, I mean, sort of laying out the extraordinary failure of the leadership that left these people to defend themselves and just basically like ifkirotam, like what's like lafkir, like what?
Yeah.
Abandoned, right?
Well,
That is definitely, and also something, if I would just sort of that one of the things that I also think that's very important here is when people talk like the people who are sort of responding or about like already on October, like soon after, saying that this felt like the Holocaust, right? This has been a big discussion where people said this felt like the Holocaust. And the Holocaust scholars have been very quick to come and say this was not the Holocaust. We have one of the most powerful militaries in the world, right? But I think what's missing there is the distinction between what people were feeling with these memories and the trauma of hiding in closets, not having anybody to help them, hiding under beds, trying to keep their children quiet so that they wouldn't be heard. That was sort of this experience similar to the Holocaust in those moments, as opposed to the larger. And that's why I also think this quote by Michal Dekel is such an interesting one for us to think sort of intellectually about this, is that this was something that through the establishment of the state, like as Amos Oz's father was saying to him, should have belonged to a bygone era. And it did not, and it does not. And the failure of the leadership and the government to even acknowledge, and the sort of cynical use of the hostages on the stage of the UN and refusing to meet with the hostage families is very much sorry. That was maybe too long a response, but and if I'm getting carried into sort of today at the UN, but let me take these two more questions, Paul and then Shmuel, and then yeah.
So just a brief comment, in a way, understanding why you made the comparison. I think that the point of the comparison you made at the beginning is not so much to see the structural, political, meta similarities, but I think that what really is at stake here is the humanity. Something, as many of you know, I'm an early modernist, so I've dealt with, especially for example, the Fettmilch uprising in Frankfurt in the early 17th century. We don't have anything like this. We don't have any kind of memorialization where we can perceive the people, the names, the familiar realities,
The voices.
everything becomes so abstract when we talk about these massacres. And I think that one of the horrifying, I guess, unexpected upshots of this mass media starting the early 20th century is the completely different phenomenological approach to the tragedy that I don't think we should minimize. And in that sense, I do see at some level something new happening in the 20th century, so that even more pronounced in the case of social media.
Thank you. Shmuel, you want?
Speaking of
Yeah, this would be the last.
speaking of traumas and failures and tapping into Jewish history, we forgot about the more recent trauma that happened on Yom Kippur
Right, the Yom Kippur War.
in the same month, which goes to show, and I remember reading the newspapers before Yom Kippur, before October 7th, and it was full of stories about the war. And now we talk about October 7th, and it goes to show the impact of this drama
Right.
on the Israeli psyche.
Absolutely. And I think, and in this book that I recommend reading, right, and that obviously, like, that's what so many people were saying. And I think that from my understanding, that's also one of the reasons why, like, that this was sort of intentionally meant to evoke Yom Kippur also by Hamas, my understanding of it. But, we know with Yom Kippur and the commissions, the commission that came afterwards to investigate what happened and this failure of the leadership for the people, right? It was this very much this idea of the conceptia and this hubris of the military elite and the government, but of saying and along the lines of we have the best media, we have the best military in the world, and walls and this technology are going to keep us out, like as I felt when I was there the year before. If there are more questions, because now as director, I need to bring this to a close. If there are more questions, please come see me. Thank you for coming, and Gmar Chatima Tova. May we all see better days.